Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about Rome's great crisis of the 3rd century. In this episode, The Terrible Plague, we will talk about how a climate shift led to an agricultural crisis in Rome. This agricultural crisis led to a malnourished and weakened population that was vulnerable to the coming plague of Cyprian, which would transform the Roman Empire. In the last 2 episodes, we talked mainly about military reverses and civil conflict within the empire. These took their toll, but alone they wouldn't have sundered the Roman Empire. After all, Rome endured civil upheaval before the reign of Augustus, after the misrule of Nero, and after the death of Commodus. None of these episodes brought about generational harm, partly because the Romans benefited from a good climate. The centuries during which the empire reached its peak are known today as the Roman climate optimum. From 200 BC to around 200 AD, Europe and Asia enjoyed a warm, wet, and stable climate. In an agricultural economy, these conditions became a major boost to wealth. The population grew fast because of readily available food, and with Rome creating a free trade zone that spanned 3 continents, they could grow the crops best suited for their own country while importing other foods they needed from across the world. However, from the 240s onward, the climate became less reliable. The all-important annual Nile flood, which brought about the Egyptian grain harvest that fed Rome, became unreliable. Droughts and severe cold spells became more common. In short, the Roman climate optimum became far less optimal. While the Romans might ignore the squabbles for power as long as armies did not directly come through their land, they could not ignore the fast-rising food prices, shortages, and even famine. Tragically, these food shortages left an undernourished and weakened population far more vulnerable to disease, which came north through Ethiopia, arriving there in 250 AD. While there are not enough symptoms to identify the Cyprian plague for certain, modern scientists believe it may have been a viral hemorrhagic fever similar to modern-day Ebola. In any case, it followed the trade routes which still operated in the Roman Empire at the time, though at a lower capacity than before the crisis. In Rome alone, 5,000 people died each day, with the dead being hurled into plague pits. There, laborers would stomp the broken, bleeding bodies into the pit until they burst. Sufferers experienced bouts of diarrhea, continuous vomiting, fever, deafness, paralysis of the legs and feet, swollen throats, and blood filling their eyes. Cyprian, a Carthaginian bishop and eyewitness for whom the plague is named, described a terrifying illness in his writings. He wrote, "As the strength of the body is dissolved, the bowels dissipate in a flow. A fire that begins in the inmost depths burns up into wounds in the throat. The intestines are shaken with continuous vomiting. The eyes are set on fire from the force of the blood, as weakness prevails through the failures and losses of the bodies. The gait is crippled, or the hearing is blocked." For bishops such as Cyprian, the plague became unmistakable proof of the superiority of Christianity over traditional Roman religion. Seeing the pestilence as an opportunity to put their deeply held beliefs into action, early Christians set about caring for the sick and giving proper burials to the dead, without any charge to the survivors. On the other hand, fear overwhelmed the pagan establishment, who interpreted epidemics as signs of the gods' anger. Indeed, one of the reasons for Decius's mass sacrifices, described in the last episode, was likely to appease the gods' wrath. Obviously, they did not succeed. However, the Roman priesthood still held the power. When their own rites and sacrifices failed, they searched for scapegoats. In part because the Christians refused to sacrifice, they faced persecution, as Christians believed they aroused the gods' anger with their strange ways. Horrific persecutions followed. Entire Christian communities had to evacuate the cities where they emerged. Many fled into the hinterlands. However, since they took flight at a time when foreign nations made incursions into Rome's borders, many of them became slaves in Parthia and Gothic Dacia. Nonetheless, the remaining Christian communities in the empire gained new respectability for carrying out burials for the dead. Christians also nursed the sick and dying, and those who died of the illness while nursing others claimed martyrdom, in turn offering non-believers who would convert the possibility of rewards in the Christian afterlife. At the beginning of the plague of Cyprian, there were only a few 100,000 Christians. By its end in 270 AD, there were over 1 million. However, the plague of Cyprian did not only take a toll on Rome's pagan faith, but Rome's numbers as well. Emperors still found themselves having to lead wars against foreign enemies, but had fewer soldiers with which to wage these wars. Decius, the emperor who led the persecutions of the Christians, headed north to lead the new campaign against a Gothic king named CNIVA. CNIVA was an example of a Romanized barbarian. In the Germanic style, he led a host of warriors kept loyal with booty taken from enemies. However, he also used Roman trade contacts and military discipline to grow that all-important wealth and expand his kingdom to greater extents than his forefathers ever imagined. Even better, CNIVA knew that he could become richer and stronger with 1 good year raiding Rome than 10 years plundering the north. So CNIVA crossed the Danube River to raid Moesia and Thrace. This is the first time that the Goths appeared in the Roman historical record, and they would of course appear again during the sacking of Rome in 410. At first, Decius's sacrifices and persecutions appeared to have won the favor of the gods. While King CNIVA besieged Nicopolis on the Danube River, Decius surprised him, and the Goths had to flee through the difficult terrain of the Balkan Peninsula. However, CNIVA unexpectedly doubled back and surprised Decius near Barrow, sacking his camp and dispersing his army. The Goths then moved to besiege Philippopolis. The governor of Thrace, Titus Julius Priscus, offered CNIVA a bargain. He offered to open the gates to CNIVA's Goths if he were allowed to declare himself emperor under Gothic protection. CNIVA agreed. Furthermore, CNIVA promised to only loot and murder Priscus's enemies rather than Priscus's friends. However, once CNIVA entered the city, he forgot his promise, murdering both Priscus's friends, his enemies, and finally Priscus himself. Then the invaders began returning to their homeland, laden with booty and captives, among them many men of senatorial rank. Decius had returned with his reorganized army, accompanied by his son Herennius Etruscus and military leader Trebonianus Gallus, intending to defeat the invaders and recover the captives. He left his younger son Hostilius, little more than a child, back in Rome to wear the purple in case things went badly. At first, the campaign appeared to go well again. They appear to have cornered the Goths in swampy ground near the Danube plain. At the Battle of Abritus, the Goths fought with the courage of the desperate. Yet the tide turned when Decius's son Herennius was killed by an arrow early in the battle. To cheer his men, Decius shouted, "Let no one mourn. The death of one soldier is not a great loss to the Republic." Was this bravado to keep the fight going, or did he not care for his son's death? In any case, Decius's army grew entangled in the swamp and wiped out. Decius himself died in the fighting, the first Roman emperor to die at barbarian hands. He would not be the last. Hostilian, the second son of Decius, died of the plague back in Rome, mere weeks after the deaths of his father and brother. With plague causing terrible mortalities, Roman agriculture grinding to a halt, the Danube legions badly beaten, and a budding dynasty crushed by the Goths, Rome's crisis of the 3rd century grew graver than ever before. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.